the international news. To international news now, dozens of world leaders are joining President Vladimir Zelensky in Switzerland to explore how to bring about peace to Ukraine. Zelensky is hoping to sustain the momentum of this week's G7 meeting when leaders agreed to give Ukraine a $50 billion loan from profits that were seized from Russian assets and a new security deal signed with US President Joe Biden. Now, the gathering aims to start sketching out a possible peace process. Ukraine has its own formula for that, which involves retaking control of all its occupied territory, but such contentious points won't be touched on just yet. And beyond a broad show of support for Kiev, expectations for the summit are rather low. Russia has not been invited, and Moscow has dismissed the event as worthless without it. China will also not attend in solidarity with Russia. At the same time, Russian President Vladimir Putin has made new demands for a ceasefire with Ukraine. He wants Ukraine to withdraw its troops from the entire territory of the 4 regions Moscow claims as its own and to drop its NATO aspirations. Now, Putin's demands were issued ahead of a meeting of more than 90 countries in Switzerland this weekend to discuss a Western-led peace plan. Dasha Shenishova has more from Moscow.
Moscow says officials in Kiev are depriving the people of Ukraine of a real chance for peace by rejecting President Putin's peace proposal. On Friday, Russian president said Moscow would cease fire in Ukraine and start negotiations once Kiev withdraws its troops from the entire territory of Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics, as well as Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. Vladimir Putin also said that Ukraine should drop its NATO bid, be a neutral and non-nuclear country. This should be enshrined in international documents and go hand in hand with the lifting of anti-Russian sanctions. However, if the West and Kiev reject this offer, Putin said the responsibility for continued bloodshed will rest on them. He also said that the global security architecture has collapsed and the world is close to the point of no return because of Western hostile actions. These comments come ahead of the Ukrainian peace conference due in Switzerland this weekend. Dasha Cherneshova, SABC News, Moscow.
All right, to further this discussion, let's now welcome Professor Malte Brosig, who is a professor in international relations at Wits University. Professor, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. So, Russian President Vladimir Putin has called on Ukraine to withdraw from 4 eastern regions that are partially occupied by his forces as a condition of those peace talks, a demand which, of course, Kiev has dismissed as manipulative on the eve of a conference on the war to which, of course, Moscow hasn't been invited to. So what do you make of all these moves?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I think at the moment we are not exactly in a phase where we are speaking over like specific agreements here. So I think Moscow just put something on the table to be in the game, but what Putin proposed is basically what is called blame shifting in psychology, where the oppressor tries to, shift the blame for the misery on its own victim, which of course is bizarre.
Now, word is that National Security Advisor Sidney Mofamadi, as well as Director General of International Relations, Dr. Zain Dengo, will actually be going to Switzerland for those peace talks, which, of course, we know Russia has not been invited to. So what do you think this weekend's Ukraine Peace Summit will actually achieve?
160 countries have been invited to this event, and 92, I think, have accepted it, and a few international organizations are also there, with the UN being in observer status. That in itself is already not a low number of countries, so I think from the Ukrainian perspective, they will definitely count this as a success. So what it will bring in the end will, of course, have to wait for a final declaration. It is likely that this final declaration will repeat that, for instance, the UN Charter should still be upheld, and this will be quite important also from Ukraine, because it then refers automatically to its territorial integrity. And this is something that Ukraine is eager to reinstall. Of course, it's not very likely that we are having direct talks with Russia right now. So, however, if we look back over 5 years, maybe this might be one of the early steps towards peace. And it's still important to have these gatherings, so that when the time is right, one can more easily, use these platforms for more meaningful and substantial talks in the end.
But Prof, what is the point if, of course, Russia is not invited to these talks?
Well, Mr. Putin said if he would have been invited, he would not have accepted the invitation, actually. So
but he wasn't
it looks
invited.
like Russia is not. Nobody said if he would be invited, he would not be going, actually. From the Ukrainian side, what we heard is that, they feared that Moscow would basically torpedo preparation and talks here. What it turns out, however, is I think it's important that at the moment this summit can still, play the game of political signaling in early on chartering a way towards more meaningful peace talks. We are not there, and I guess it will take a lot of time and much more effort behind closed doors, I guess, to come to more substantial agreements here. However, what is on the table are like 3 or 4 agenda items here, and this is nuclear security. This refers to issues in and around the nuclear plant in Zaporizhia, but also the question of food safety, because Ukraine is one of the very large food exporters, and that's relevant also for African countries, for example. And last but not least, it's also the question of exchange of prisoners. And this is a territory where Ukraine and Russia are actually in direct talks, but it's extremely sluggish.
And then, Prof, what would you say then are the most important issues that need to be at the top of that agenda as these talks get underway?
I think, the very first step is this political signaling. If you have 92 countries coming together and they carefully charter a way out of the conflict, this can be meaningful in the end. And the fact that Russia is responding to this gathering already tells us that they do care of what's going on. And of course, at some point, this has to translate into direct talks, but you cannot really do this with international media at the table at the same time and 92 countries being there as well. So this has to be at a much smaller, much more close environment, maybe, of course, with a neutral facilitator in the background.
And a team, speaking of that neutral facilitator, we understand that a team of 7 African presidents actually led an initiative in mid-June of last year. I'm sure you remember this, in an attempt to make peace in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. And we also saw the results of that, Prof. Is there anything at this stage, right, that we as South Africa can even try to facilitate peace in Ukraine, especially at the back of our recent results on the Israel ICJ case? Also taking into consideration our recent election results as well as the stance that the country has taken, with much uncertainty around how our foreign policy is actually going to look like?
Well, I think managing expectations is extremely important here, right? So it's a bit unlikely that from an outside initiative will immediately bring peace, right? So this is not really realistic. But again, there can be and there will be many different steps and initiatives, and different countries have taken different initiatives. And by now, we don't know which initiative will take off the ground, but I guess there will be a time when, there is space for more meaningful talks. But they will be most likely rather behind closed doors. They will take a lot of time, a lot of effort, and they need then in the end also external guarantees. We are not there. I guess we are quite far from it right now, but it's never give up trying. And the African mission was also important because it brought up very clearly that the question of food security is quite essential for African countries and developing countries. And that was a very straightforward message.
And of course, those meaningful talks, Professor, obviously need all those members that are on the warring sides on the same table. Thank you so much for your input this afternoon, Professor Malte Brosig, the Wits International Relations Lecturer.